Whether fighting at a remote Imperial outpost, an awakening Necron tomb world, or a war-torn Hive city, the type of terrain you choose and the placement of it is very important. Now, it might not seem that difficult setting up a Warhammer table, but if not done correctly, it can cause an array of problems which can really affect the game. In this video, I'm going to show you how I create tables which are not only great to look at, but are also very functional for Warhammer 40k. Hello everyone, my name is Sam and this is Big Nerds Wargaming. For those of you who've been watching this channel for a while, you know that I like to collect terrain and create beautiful tables to play on. Now for me, creating a table with a cohesive theme is almost as important as the armies that fight on them. For me, it creates like a backdrop for the battle that's about to take place, and it creates a greater sense of immersion and really makes the whole experience enjoyable for both players. Now if you're looking for how to set up a table for tournament play, you can go ahead and click away from this video because Games Workshop has already provided that with official tournament play terrain layout schemes. Now I think these look a little silly because they're not representative of what an actual city grid would look like, but I understand why they exist in the competitive scene because functionality and balance are kind of most important when you're playing in a tournament, but I think they kind of look silly, and quite frankly, most of us aren't really playing tournament level Warhammer, so we're just kind of at a friend's house or going to a local game store and we're grabbing some terrain and throwing it on the table, and we're just playing a game from either Crusade or the Match Play mission deck. So whether I'm at home or at a local game store, I generally follow this set of guidelines for setting up terrain, and it's really never steered me wrong. So let's take a look at Match Play guidelines. Number 1. Place objective markers and mark off deployment zones first. Number 2. If you're not sure how much terrain to use, I would follow the general guideline of 1 piece of terrain for every square foot on the table. Number 3. Avoid firing lanes that go down the entire length of the table. A lot of people often run into this problem when they're setting up a city grid, and the city streets are sometimes parallel to the deployment zones, and it ends up creating these awkward firing lanes where turn 1 you can shoot all the way across the table into the opponent's deployment zone. That's usually not ideal for match play setting. You want to be able to have line of sight blocking terrain so you can screen your units and then move them out in the subsequent battle rounds where you then start making some real shots at your opponent. Number 4. More terrain is generally better. This may be a little counterintuitive, but I like to, after I set up the big line of sight blocking terrain, I like to scatter in some smaller pieces such as crates and barrels and craters. But one thing to keep in mind is to make sure that your larger models can still move around the battlefield and make their way across. Number 5, find something tall to block line of sight. Now this could be rock or mountain formations, maybe some tall hills, either natural or man-made or structures. And then the other thing you can use is maybe perhaps a tall ruin. And I like to generally place these, which is tip number 6, is place these tall line of sight blocking terrains generally in the center, and then you also want to have some good line of sight blocking terrain near the deployment zones, so as you set up your models before you start the game, you can screen them and have them covered from turn 1 fire from your opponent. And number 7, don't be afraid to modify the terrain rules. So sometimes when I play on my jungle board, I have these big patches of dense jungle terrain, and often I'll work out with my opponent and say, hey, this jungle terrain, it's not actually a woods, let's treat it as a ruin where it blocks line of sight if you're behind it unless you're inside of it, and that way we can kind of play with like city ruin rules, but we'll have a very natural looking table with these big dense jungle pieces, and it just kind of changes up the feel of the game a little bit. Or perhaps if you want to create your own rules, this is more so for narrative games, but maybe you want to create some dangerous terrain where if you move over it, there's a chance that maybe some models will suffer some mortal wounds or something. And lastly, number 8, for a match play game, you want generally the table to feel balanced and symmetrical, where there's a good amount of similar line of sight blocking terrain on both sides, so that it really doesn't matter what side you get if you're attacker or defender, but you still roll off for it, and maybe you have a preference to one or the other, but generally speaking, it should feel pretty balanced and fair. And if it's not, just go ahead and move the pieces around until it feels fair. In this first example, I'm going to be setting up a matched play table using my own advice, and this is going to be just a simple Gothic ruin, city, urban type of table, because most game stores have this type of terrain available. So I start off by creating 2 large pieces in the center, and then this terrain is stuff that I've 3D printed, and I'm also using some Citadel terrain. Alright, so you can see here we have the main structures placed. A good amount of diversity here, but you can see I've made a couple mistakes. So if you look down these lines here and straight down the center, we have some open firing lanes that allows you to shoot straight across into the other deployment zone, depending on how you set up. Or also if someone deep strikes over here, they'll be able to shoot all the way down the table. So I generally like to break up these long kind of corridors of shooting with some additional scattered terrain. Alright, so you can see our deployment zones here. We have a lot of good line of sight blocking cover, so you can deploy your units in a way so they don't get blown off the table in turn 1. And also the city looks somewhat believable. So we have some streets going down this side here. We have some streets over here. Now obviously we have some crates blocking the roadway, but that's okay because this is a ruined city after all. But you can kind of see the remnants of the grid layout. So it's a believable city. It's telling a story. It got shelled out like crazy, but now it creates an interesting battlefield for your 2 armies to fight against. So there we go. This is a good example of a balanced match play table. We have 2 large structures kind of in the center of the table, causing a lot of line of sight blocking, and as well as additional cover everywhere else. There's good cover for screening, for deployment. Yeah, this is good. I like it. It feels balanced, but yet a little bit different. There's no clear advantage depending on what side you pick. Maybe this side's a little bit better, and you could balance that out by maybe moving some of like this building over here somewhere. But overall, it's pretty balanced. So I like it. All right, this next one's going to be a Hammer and Anvil map. So the theme for this one's going to be a junkyard that's been looted by the orcs. Let's get our objective markers set up first and our deployment zones marked off. And 22 for number 2, 6 inches for number 3, 10 inches here, 18. And with the deployment zone marked off, it's time to start laying out the rubble. So I am using some 3D printed Gothic ship ruin, and that's going to be the central piece of this table. It's got these nice long walls, so I'm using those to block off the center of the table and to create some interesting kill lanes. After that, I'm going to take some orc terrain from the Kill Team Octarius set, and I'm going to set up an orc fort on one side of the table, and then throw in some scattered terrain, so some debris fields and cover. And on the other side of the table, I'm going to put in some Imperial Industrial terrain. And then in the center, I make a big stack of crates because I think that would make a really interesting centerpiece. Lastly, throwing in some additional scattered terrain. Alright, this is looking pretty good. Let's do a walk around and see how it looks. Okay, so we have the Junkyard battlefield. Remember, we have Hammer and Anvil deployment, so this is going to be the defender side. We have some big line of sight blocking terrain here in the center with a big stack of crates. And the ship ruins, kind of just acting as a normal ruin or wall. maybe you can move through it, maybe not. So that's one thing you have to determine with your opponent, is how you're going to play different terrain pieces. So something like this, I would say infantry cannot move through, but maybe over here, since there's these gun ports, maybe the infantry can move through. So you just have to work that out with your opponent. And then over here we have the attacker deployment zone. Lots of good line of sight blocking terrain with the ruins for screening your deployment, which is really handy, but it's also, the defender gets similar options. So overall it feels very balanced. So then we have the theme here. We have the orcs raiding and setting up the fort on one side, and then you have the Imperial side on this side, and then just kind of junk and terrain and debris scattered throughout the whole center. So that was 2 examples for setting up a board for a casual match play game. But what about Crusade or your own custom narrative games? Well, this is where I think you as the player have the most freedom to kind of really set it up however you want, so long as it really fits in with the spirit of the scenario. A lot of times with Crusade missions, they'll have some designer's commentary in the mission pack for that particular mission that'll give you some guidelines. Like, for example, the Pariah Nexus Necrons versus Necrons video, which you can check out right here. That had some commentary for setting up the terrain in the defender's area to be really dense and kind of like claustrophobic. So we tried to mimic that by having most of the Necron terrain over on the defender's side. So here's my narrative play setup guidelines. Number 1, try to match the theme of the mission. So if I know who my opponent is, or if I have some faction terrain, sometimes I'll try to set up the battlefield or pick a planet that maybe my army's attacking or defending, and we'll try to create a kind of cohesive theme around that and create a table that matches both the mission and our armies. Number 2, it might not be balanced, but sometimes that's okay. So with Crusade missions especially, a lot of them tend to be a little asymmetrical, so setting up the terrain in an asymmetrical manner that fits the scenario might still be okay, and still be a really fun game. And you know, it doesn't have to be like your match play game where the terrain's set up in a very symmetrical manner and it doesn't matter which deployment zone you get, attacker or defender. I think Crusade is where tables really get interesting, where you can set up some really unique boards. Number 3, tailor the table to the 2 armies that are being played on it. So, you know, with the tournament, you don't know what kind of army that is going to be played on the table, so that's why they have very strict or very prescriptive terrain setup guidelines. Or if you're playing a match play game, you kind of have very prescriptive guidelines. But if you're playing a narrative game, generally you kind of work out with your opponent what kind of list you're going to be using, whether it's going to be heavy infantry or heavy vehicle. Sometimes, like I even share my list with my opponent sometimes, and we try to kind of keep them at the same power level as far as, you know, nastiness goes. But with that in mind, you can also, if you know what each opponent is bringing to the table, you can set up the entire battlefield to really fit those specific models. Like if it's a really infantry heavy army, maybe you can create a more smaller, tight, claustrophobic battlefield where there's very little room to maneuver if you have a vehicle, or vice versa. And lastly, number 4, this is where you have the most freedom to create your own terrain rules. Now, in my local gaming group's Crusade League, Andrew, who you've seen on the channel before, he's running it as the game master, and he's actually created a bunch of different terrain rules depending on what type of planet we're fighting on. Like if you're fighting on a death world, maybe there's some, you know, sandstorm that reduces line of sight, or maybe there's a piece of terrain that can cause mortal wounds if you get close to it. So you really have a lot of freedom to create some really interesting terrain rules and really enhance your game experience. Alright, this next one is the Crusade setup. So we have the Leviathan book, and I just picked this one here because it looked interesting. Screaming into the Void. As the Grindulous tendrils surged into the outer systems of the Bastior subsector, desperate attempts were made to send out warnings and cries for aid before the shadow of the warp smothered all. So this scenario, you have the defender and the attacker, and the defender has to send off a distress signal. This is a really cool scenario and lends a lot of opportunity to make a really interesting battlefield that really tells a story. So let's go ahead and do that. So really leaning into this scenario, I'm making an Imperial base with some communications equipment. So imagine that they have to send off a signal. And then I wanted to add some defenses, so I created some barricades and crates and walls around the equipment so that the defenders would really hunker down back there. Next, I take some of my rock formations to add some cover for the attackers, along with my jungle terrain, which I created from some plastic plants I got at a craft store. And then lastly, I like to take the Death World terrain and place them all over the rock formations to help them look like jungle rocks. And then I place some more scattered terrain all around to really fill in the jungle and make it feel really claustrophobic, like it's closing in around you. And then lastly, this wouldn't be a Tyranid invasion without some Tyranid terrain, so I placed in some pieces that I 3D printed for my Tyranids, so that it looks like they're kind of halfway through consuming the jungle world. Alright, there we go. We have a claustrophobic jungle. Now, some of you might think this is a little too much terrain, but I think it's a great amount of terrain for a narrative game because I want to create a sense of dread, like there's a dense jungle and the Tyranids can just come pouring out of the jungle. It's kind of a last desperate attempt to hold down the base and send off the emergency distress signal. So let's take a quick look around the battlefield I created. I gotta say, of all the jungle boards I have made, this one's actually one of my favorites. It actually feels very claustrophobic, very busy. There's a lot of life. It looks like the very board itself could attack and cause some harm to the armies fighting on it. Like the base over here, kind of like ramshackle defenses set up, ready to hold off the invasion. We got flora everywhere. Some good rack formations for the attacker to kind of cover some of the bigger units, and then you can swarm in the infantry through these pathways here. I think this would make a really interesting table, especially for this scenario, Screaming into the Void. So I've showed you how to create 3 different tables, 2 for match play, 1 for Crusade. I hope you found these guidelines helpful and interesting, and if there's anything that you had questions on, or maybe there's some things that you like to do or tips and tricks that you like to use when you're setting up tables and I didn't mention them, let me know in the comment section below. I'm really curious to hear what you have to say and what you think about this video. If you like this video, hit that like button, and if you like what we're doing here on the channel and want to support us, consider subscribing. Well, I'm going to leave us with that. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.